Welcome to the Roleplaying Tips Podcast, GM advice, tips, and stories to help you have more fun at every game.
Hello, Game Master. My name is John Four, and thank you very much for tuning into Roleplaying Tips. I have 3 questions to answer in today's episode. And the first two questions actually, come from a member of the Adventure Design course that I'm running. And I had an Ask Me Anything thread running for the course, and I neglected to answer this person's 2 questions. So I apologize for that, and I'm going to rectify that mistake today. So the first question that the person has is about balancing encounters. And their question is, how would you proceed to check if an upcoming battle encounter is balanced, considering abilities, gear, and so on? I've had the issue twice that the boss fight was too easy, while a boss minion fight was slightly too challenging. Of course, it comes down to the dice gods, but experience as GM and stats play a big role. How to weigh them against each other? NetSky. Well, NetSky, you may or may not like my answer, but here goes. The first is, I don't actually believe that there is such thing as encounter balance. The game system that you might be playing, such as Dungeons & Dragons, might have baked into the game rules a counterbalance system where you perform different mathematical operations, taking into account the party level, different character levels, and the foe levels. But ultimately, encounters have too many variables for a game master to balance, I think, before the game. Several reasons for this. The first is party composition often doesn't match the ideal party of the game designers, the ideal kind of character and party makeup that the game designers had in mind when they were designing the game. So it also doesn't account for players that are missing. So depending on how you handle absentee players, if you have the characters either there, but they're just cardboard cutouts and they're not as effective as if an actual player was running them. If you have a player running the absent player's character plus their own, then you're going to have a reduction in you're going to have a distraction, and that player is not going to be as skillful at operating his characters as if each character was operated independently. And if you have the character just disappear, which is what my group does, then you minus that character's abilities. So out of the box, that encounter is going to depend on who's at the game session. It also doesn't factor in current party strength most of the time. So if the certain spells have been cast, then that's going to change what the complexion of the encounter is going to be. For example, if the wizard has cast all of their fireballs and you have a larger area encounter with lots of minions there, then that minion encounter is going to be more difficult. Whereas if the mage has used up all of her first or second level spells but has a fireball still on tap, then that encounter is going to be a whole lot easier. The biggest reason, though, I think that encounter balance is kind of a bad thing to pursue down to a granular level is because of player and group style. So different group styles will affect how they approach the game and how they approach the tactics of combat. You might have an aggressive party, and they will just unleash everything that they have onto encounters. And so this means they might expend their resources earlier than expected before leading up to the current encounter that you've got planned and have tried to balance. They might be cautious players. So they still have a lot in reserve, but they tend to sneak in, scout around, form a plan, and then attack tentatively. And both of those cases, taken to an extreme, just for the purposes of example, lead to completely different gameplay. And you can't balance an encounter specifically out of the books against that. You can cater your encounters to party style, and you can anticipate what the party's going to do in an encounter. But I don't think that you can balance an encounter because you're never quite sure what the party's going to do. All right, another type of group style is thinkers versus feelers. So the thinkers are going to probably overthink the game, and they're going to plan and tactically have an order of operations and different combinations of character abilities that, when stacked up in a certain order, provide very powerful combat support. And The feelers are there for the fun of the game and the experience of the game and for camaraderie, and they're going to be less tactically minded and less combat proficient in general. Another type of style that can screw up and counterbalance is hackers versus role players. The hackers are going to wade into melee with glee. The role players are going to want to talk to the foes and solve the encounters through negotiation, coercion, and trickery. So again, how do you balance encounters against different possible approaches to the game? Horde versus tactical. So murder hobos in my campaign attack en masse. No plan survives first contact with the enemy in my group. They just might have a plan, but generally after the first round, once initiative is rolled, they start acting as independent operators. Versus tactical groups that have basically different assigned roles to the party. There might be a party leader. They're very organized. They perform things in a certain order. They have discipline and structure to the way that they approach combat. And then there's player experience. So I'll be soon GMing a group of first-time players. And these players don't have that history of playing the game and playing RPGs in general. So they don't know what's possible. So they're going to approach the game in any given encounter from mostly their own real life experiences and from the books that they've read. And therefore, they're not going to make assumptions, and they're not going to limit their thinking to what they know about the game rules and all the things that they've learned from past gameplay. In other words, they don't know the tropes of the game being played. And so they might have wildly unexpected actions, or most likely they'll have common sense actions, not self-limited by previous experience and gameplay rules limitations. So I think party and group style greatly affect how difficult it is to balance an encounter. Then you've got luck. You've mentioned the dice gods, and then ultimately the game master. Did the game master bring the A game? Are they on the ball today? Are you up to the tactical challenge of running several foes again intelligently up to the foe's maximum potential to the players tonight? And if not, then the encounter is going to be easier for the players. And if you're on and the players are off, then you have that kind of imbalance. So this is why I think you should not spend a whole lot of time balancing encounters. Instead, take your best guess on what a good encounter will be, taking account into players' anticipated remaining resources and gear and whatnot. And then be flexible. Modify the encounter on the fly. Consider the game itself, like the whole session and the whole adventure and campaign, is a marathon and not a sprint. So don't beat yourself up if an encounter that was planned to be difficult turns out to be easy, and vice versa, because you can serve up more encounters. You have a monster making machine in your world. You can just crank out more foes and more villains. So if it turns out that if an encounter is easy, that's a reward for the players, especially if it's because they played smart. But even if they got lucky, it feels like they've won the game. It feels like it's a good feeling to just clobber your foes sometimes. So don't beat yourself up. A couple of tips here. Work to increase encounter day lengths. So in the marathon spirit, try to have more encounters between players recoup of their abilities. Also improve encounter flex over time. So improve your ability to make encounters more difficult or less difficult on the fly. Make that a GMing goal and a skill that you want to learn. And then see the whole system, not just the encounter zoom. So understand that the adventure is a whole bunch of encounters. Understand that the campaign is a whole bunch of adventures. The game is more than just any given encounter in any given game night. And while you want to produce the most enjoyable play for your players, understand how the different aspects of the game all kind of work together like cogs in a clock and provide an enjoyable experience. So again, don't try too hard to balance something beforehand. Be flexible and make sure that the game is enjoyable on multiple levels. Don't always beat yourself up over the difficulty and precision of difficulty. All right, a couple of tips here about how to adjust encounters on the fly and in when you're preparing a game. Think damage and defense. So these two levers Manipulating damage and manipulating defense of the characters and their foes are your best and easiest ways to change encounter difficulty on the fly. For damage, you want to increase damage. By doing so, you increase the challenge of encounters. If you decrease damage, then you decrease the challenge of encounters. But by increasing the amount of damage that the characters can do to their foes in a given round, or vice versa, then you're going to make the combats faster, which is, I think, always a goal that you should have, so that you can fit more gameplay into every session. Especially if an encounter or a combat is not going well. If you completely botched your attempt at creating a fun encounter or a balanced encounter, then at least it's over with fast, and the players celebrate their easy victory or go back unexpectedly licking their wounds when the minions clobbered them. So damage, I think, is the easiest lever that you can wield to make encounters more or less challenging. It also leaves the player resources intact, so this is kind of a caveat. So if you increase the damage dice of the monster, for example, then the players and the combat is over faster because you've changed the monster's defenses, so allowing the characters to do more damage. With a faster combat, you're going to leave more character resources intact, which means that you have basically longer encounter days. You can fit more encounters in before the players need to rest. But just understand how that mini system works. Faster combats means more encounters that the players are capable of because they don't consume their resources all in one combat. And then more damage ultimately gives you a good panic round where the PCs may react emotionally and just throw off all of their most powerful abilities. So this is something that you can design with intent, and it's kind of a counteract to PCs not using up their resources in faster combats. So if you increase the damage to increase the challenge, and then you lay down the foe's best attacks in the first round, you try to either ambush the PCs, or you have all the the big damage spells and the clobbering attacks and the one-off abilities of the foes all try to trigger on the same round and kind of rack up this massive damage total. It's going to create a lot of excitement in your players, and then they might react by throwing off their nuclear bombs when it was an easy encounter or an easier than expected encounter and they should have saved them. So some DM tactics there. Ways to increase damage. First, you can use combat hazards, so you can make the environment hostile. The other last game I had magma rain, so it was raining droplets of fire because the elements are going haywire on the PCs in the elemental game that I'm running, and so that was causing D6 damage every round that they're out in the open that they failed a saving throw. It meant more dice being rolled, but saving throws are generally fast throws to make. And the environment was slowly wicking away the players' hit points totals, and that, of course, makes them nervous and makes the combats go faster as well. You can look at using any kind of damage increasing rules in your game system as possible. So, for example, two-handed wielding a weapon two-handed often increases the damage output. You can bump up foe damage modifiers. I do this quite often. I'll just add the dice. So if they do 2d6 damage and the encounter is unbalanced and way too easy, I'll have the foes do 3d6 damage. Or I'll do things like add poison to the foes' blades, or I'll have them have an extra attack around anything that I can do to have them increase their damage output. I'll also try to increase their damage modifiers. So that means they have greater chance of hitting, they'll hit more often, and more damage is being done to the characters. And then you can try to do things to decrease the player defenses. Again, you can use combat hazards to slow them down and give them disadvantage and have reduction in their armor class, and anything else that you can think of to chop down the player's ability to resist the damage. So that brings us to defenses. Defenses, generally, if you increase the defenses, your combats are going to go slower, and, well, I think it washes out. You don't really increase the challenge of the combat. It just makes them longer and often a slog, because you might defense is either more hit points or higher armor class or resistance. So you're just hitting and missing, or you're swinging and missing over and over again, both sides, and there's no consumption of resources. No one's getting wounded and closer to ending the battle. But on the other side, though, if you decrease the defenses, then you're going to be doing, again, more damage per round, and that's going to shorten the combat. And that makes combats faster. It also increases the general lethality perception and, again, the enjoyment of combats. Note that this tactic increases or leaves more player resources intact. So if combats are over faster, or it seems like combats are a little bit more difficult, but that the end is in sight sooner, then the players are going to hold back on their best abilities, or the best abilities that they have remaining. All right, a few ways to decrease the defenses. Combat hazards. So you can have the environment try to reduce the ability of players to resist damage. Look at monster combinations. So, for example, you can have monsters that somehow hold down and stop the players and make them easier targets to hit, and then hit them with ranged attacks with another type of monster, or monsters that have been armed with certain kind of weapon that gives them ranged attacks. I just used range as an example. Melee is also effective. Anything that can basically decrease player resistance and then give fellow monsters an increased chance to hit. So you can have special rules in your game that might affect armor class. What I suggest is going through your combat section and listing out all the rules, making a cheat sheet of yourself of anything that increases damage and decreases defense. Things like making foes prone and using cover. Or removing cover. Actually, we want to decrease the damage there. Keyed attacks. So if you look at maybe an intelligent villain, after first few brushes with the encounters, will understand the party strengths and weaknesses, and will then send specific minions that are more likely to succeed against the PCs. That is a logical in-game story way to have foes that seem to kind of lock cunningly against the PCs to be more effective against them. So if a PC has immunity to or resistance to fire because of a ring of fire resistance, then they face cold creatures. Then you're bypassing that special ability of the character to of their defense, and that makes the combats more balanced and more flex on the fly. You might have had the standard minions prepared for an encounter, but it turns out that the characters are wading into this encounter fully stocked on hit points and on abilities. So what you do is you change the energy type of the foes on the fly from fire to cold, because you know the PC wizard is susceptible to cold or something like that. And you can then bypass PC resistances easier. And you can have foes that are tailored to target the PC's weakest saves. I don't do this as a matter of course. I try to find an in-game story and a way to roleplay this, and a way to intelligence gather or to use knowledge checks, and to make it all make sense within the game world for the reasons why now the characters are suddenly facing foes that are smarter or seem to have their number. So you're not doing this to punish the characters, but these are some quick ways to have the characters face foes that are a little bit tougher because they come in a bit stronger than expected. And then special conditions. So for example, you could run a gala, a royal gala. So no heavy armor is allowed here. So the fighters are now a bit more vulnerable than usual, and their defenses are lower. They can only wear leather armor underneath their fancy dress. And another example of a special condition is being underwater, and that imposes all kinds of craziness. Actually, underwater is a bad example because I think it makes defenses higher and it nerfs some of the damage output. So it could be aerial combat where foes falling and whatnot experience a lot of damage quite often as they land. So I hope that that helps you think of ways to increase damage and decrease defense on the fly. More examples of things that you can change on the fly in general to change the difficulty level of an encounter so that you can achieve flex. So again, you're not designing forever, trying to be precise to player abilities and character strengths and weaknesses at any given time in the game, because you don't know what those are ahead of time. So instead, be flexible. Do that by changing hit points. I do this all the time. The Monster Manual in D&D 5th edition gives you a hit point total, but that is an average total. Quite often I will go to the upper 75 to 90% range of monster hit point totals if it looks like the players are having an easy go of it. Just fiddle with the damage and defense stats of foes. So make the foes more likely to hit or easier to damage. And look at second waves. So again, this is where you look at the system of things. So instead of just looking at one encounter at a time, as soon as the noise of combat erupts and the chaos of combat erupts, are any allies nearby that could drop in on round 2 or 3 and make an encounter more difficult? Are there any wandering monsters that would be aroused by the noise and want to investigate, especially looking for the smell of blood in wounded foes and looking for some easy pickings there from the battle? Look at changing their powers. So, for example, if the damage is too much for the characters and it looks like the combat is too powerful for them, then reduce foe damage dice from 2d8 to 2d6, for example, or 2d4. To increase the foe abilities, have them give them one-off items like potions. I do this all the time, and players quite often in my games will say that they're drinking our treasure. They want to sneak up on foes more often now because they know that the foes, when they get in trouble, will drink their potions of healing or drink their potions of fire breath and make the encounters more interesting. You can increase the intelligence or decrease the intelligence of foes. You can't have an in-game story if players are suddenly always fighting genius goblins. But otherwise, you can always make foes a little bit more cunning and have them act a little bit more in a little bit more coordinated fashion. Maybe you have a leader type thrown in their rank or something. Maybe they just learn from previous experiences. But smarter foes, like smarter and more disciplined PC groups, means that they offer a tougher challenge. Likewise, you can have foes make mistakes. And so it means that you need to understand tactics, combat tactics. So become a student of combat tactics. And the easiest way to do that is just to watch the players in action. If they're tactically minded, then just watch the order that they do things and what kind of attacks they do when and how they maneuver around the battlefield. If they're not good at tactics, then learn from their mistakes. And so when you become good at tactics, then that's a throttle that you can use at any time. You can make a combat less or more combat tactically intensive to change the challenge rating on the fly. And then you can role play full abilities. So for example, low intelligence creatures will often make big mistakes. Animals might flee at the first serious wound that they take. Intelligent foes, when a certain amount of damage they've taken, will retreat and regroup and try to catch the player characters at a later date when the characters are at disadvantage. So they might try to ambush the characters or get a couple more rounds next time of ranged attack before it closes to hand-to-hand melee. And then a really nice way to buffer difficulty in a game is to add one or more NPCs to the party. And these can be in the form of guides or mercenaries or the companion of the week. There's various different ways that you can throw an NPC or two into the party. And then if the party needs bailing out, the NPC can make a few lucky rolls. If the party is having easy time of it, then you can have the NPC fade into the background and either miss more often or not contribute as much. Or if they do hit, you have them do lower damage. Or you decide if the NPC is going to unleash their best ability when. So that gives you a lot of opportunity to increase or decrease the overall challenge rating if you have one or two NPCs that accompany the party. All right, I hope that gives you some ideas on how to change the challenge rating. I again say that your strategy should be to just generally create go with your gut and create an encounter that you think will be at the challenge rating that you want, and then have learn how to adjust encounters on the fly to make them more or less challenging so that you can flex to the current game conditions. Thanks for the question. Now I'm going to go on to your second question, which is about weak and strong NPCs. This again is from NetSky. I'm currently playing Black Crusade, where you can choose from a multitude of classes, but it comes down to two races: the humans, which are role-playing heavy, and genetically enhanced humans called Space Marines, which are combat heavy. The rulebook gives a good idea on how to handle the differences, but how do you handle the differences between combat and non-combat oriented characters when they find themselves in their least favorite situation? For example, the NetSky was trying to avoid shooting the weak humans with the big guns, but he feels that's cheating on the feelings of the heavy combat characters. After all, they should feel mighty in such a combat and see that the lesser humans are taking big wounds while the Space Marines simply shrug it off. So what we have here is an instance of characters of disparity in the game. And you have different roles, and the roles are not combat balanced. So the first tip I have is that you can role play everything, even in combat, so that when the role players find themselves in combat, they can still have a lot of fun in a fight. They don't have to sit in the back ranks and cower behind total cover and wait for the Space Marines to clean things up for them. You can have the foes do a lot of role playing with them in combat if your players aren't used to that. And then you can have foes be sources of clues and information and hints, in between blows while trading insults. You can try to portray foes and combat descriptions and how they're behaving and reacting to the PCs. You can have them react to the role players' attempts to parley with them and whatnot. So just be advised, you can always role play in combat. Second, talk to your players. So your party in this case should act as a team, because the game rules are structured deliberately to have this situation. So you and your players cannot deny it. You cannot force a different type of game onto what it is. And it sounds to me like this type of game needs teamwork and some tactical thought. So have a talk with your characters and your players about some best practices so that every player can have the most fun. For example, if the players are in the city and interrogating or trying to get some information from local merchants in the market, then the teamwork should involve the Space Marines not doing the parley, the introductions. They're there in the background for menacing when needed. Likewise, the role players should be given ranged attacks, combat support. If there's any kind of aid a friend rule, have healing capabilities on hand, that kind of thing, so that the characters still have good things to do in battle, but they are out of the way of the major dangers, so that the party is not constantly going up and down, and it's just uneven, not fun gameplay. So you can also try to use different foes. So rather than foes that always shoot to kill, you can have combat missions, which I've written about in Role-Playing Tips. A combat mission means that the goal is not to go down to the last hit point. You're not fighting to 0 hit points every combat. Instead, you have an objective. For example, capture the flag. So the foes have a prisoner or an item that the PCs need to rescue or recover. That's the primary goal of the party. That's where they will get their experience points or whatever reward from, is by accomplishing that mission, not by clobbering their foes down to the last hit point. And by structuring the combats that way, you can have easier combat outs or finishes or ways to end a combat. And that means that the weaker characters aren't constantly exposed through more and more rounds of danger. And it gives the strong PCs, the Space Marines, different things to think about during combat now instead of just wading in, going toe to toe, and clobbering their foes. So think about different missions that you can have. Think about reverse combat missions where the foes have missions. So, for example, I run combat missions where the foes try to steal the magic items off the players. So they'll focus their fire on one character, bring him down to 0, loot the character, and then they'll fade away. It doesn't go in the foe's favor often because the players have great abilities and ways to stop that. But that at least is the foes are waging combat with a different goal in mind than just clobbering the PCs and targeting the weaker characters just to kill them and that kind of a thing. So combat missions and reverse combat missions. You can bolster weaker PCs with special equipment that gives them more offensive power or more damage resistance or more defense. I've written a couple of articles about this. If you can go to the archives and look them up. Issue number 134, One Powerful PC's Adventure with Weak PCs. There'll be some tips in there that you might find interesting. And in issue 348, Sneaky Tactics for Weak Monsters. This doesn't directly apply to your situation, but you might be able to use some of the weak monsters tips for your weak player characters. And then, if you don't mind, I'd like to plug my course because it's relevant to both of your questions. At Faster Combat, I have created an online course for game masters. It has 60 lessons on how to create combats, how to prepare encounters, and how to do things like change combat encounter strength on the fly, how to do flex encounters, how to analyze your players, what their strengths and weaknesses are, how to analyze characters so that you understand basically their DPS, their damage in a round, and what they typically do so that they don't catch you by surprise, and so that you can anticipate things in advance so that you're basically a smarter planner without a whole lot of extra effort. How to design foes, different kinds of special abilities that you can add on to make combats interesting, not just slugfests. Basically, a lot of the tips that I just went into are discussed in more detail in my course. And if you're interested, it's available right now, fastercombat.com. All right, thanks for the plug. Next question. Rules are rules. All right, this game master asks, my GM seems to be the rules are rules no matter what type, whereas I think rules should be modified if it would be logical to do so. For example, we're facing a Kinton Strider that was asleep. The party snuck into position with the person's character climbing on top of a large rock so that they could shoot from a better angle. However, rules as written, the creature was lying down and it was considered prone, so the attacking character had a 5 penalty to hit. Also, according to the rules, since an ally was standing beside the victim, the character or the creature was considered to be in combat, and that gave the attacking character another 5 to hit penalty. So even though the player thought these penalties were ridiculous, the GM ran the encounter with rules as written. So the GM is a friend of the player, 15 years, and the reader wants to know if there's a polite way to ask the GM to kind of be more flexible, to take into account reality, or does the player just need to accept that this is the way the GM is and that's the way that the games are going to be run? All right, so this is a tricky question. This is the social aspect of RPGs, which is always the most difficult thing to address and is probably the most often asked about tip that I get. Basically, the social problems in their various forms that arise during a game. All right, first comment that I have to make is to consider the game mentality. First, understand that many points of view exist. So you need to check that you are both playing the same game, and I don't think you are. So for example, one possible point of view, this does exist, so this is not a theoretical one, but it might be not the one that your game master has, but just as an example of how the game master is seeing the world, their possible point of view is that they are playing something akin to a board game, right? And so the board game is not a simulation of reality. The board game has its own set of rules and constraints, and that's the way that gameplay is, and it's the rules that make the game fun. For example, I'm playing Monopoly. I am literally, in real life, not a Scotty dog. A Scotty dog should travel slower than a battleship. Yet if I roll 2 6s and the battleship rolls 2 1s, I effectively move around the board faster than the battleship. Yet we don't question that within the limited kind of, I don't know, world of Monopoly. The game pieces are just icons. So we have this board game mentality when playing a game like Monopoly, and we don't expect to apply certain logic to the game. I bet this is part of your game master's worldview, and they might enjoy that. They might say, okay, well, these are the rules as laid out. There's 10,000 game role-playing game systems out there. If I want a different gameplay experience, I will choose a different game system that gives me different rules for me to then experience the game with. Whereas you are looking at it from a role-playing and a simulation, perhaps, perspective, where you want to apply what would be common sense. You want the game to feel real. You want to apply the physics of the game world, not necessarily of our world, but of that which you know about the game world, into play, because you're kind of applying yourself as a person into the game, and you want the character to kind of have that freedom to understand the universe and to operate within that, because you don't feel that the game, that the character is limited by arbitrary rules. The rules are just there to serve a higher purpose. So hopefully that illustrates how you and the game master can have two completely different worldviews. And I put forth that unless you can sync up your different worldviews, then you will constantly have this friction. Ultimately, the game master has that referee hat that they wear and is the arbiter, and therefore I think you need to be the one to bend if the game master is unbendable. And unfortunately, that's a tough decision to make. So, but first, before we get to that point, have a discussion. So, first of all, in any discussion like this, your best thing to do is take the time to understand their point of view first. And you're not understanding it for the purposes of building an argument for you to counter, to argue against, for you to look at the weaknesses in their argument and the flaws in their thinking. You're just listening, right? It's one human to another. You want to understand where they're coming from so that you can completely understand what it is that they're doing. They're looking through, the lens through which they're looking through when they play the game. You're not judging here. You're not thinking of your reply. You're just kind of just listening and being empathetic with them. If you can do that, that is the best possible way to start out this discussion. Because no matter how the discussion ends, at least you understand this other person quite well now. And that gives you, I think, a lot of benefit. Whether it softens your position because now you have empathy for them, you know it's not an us versus them kind of a thing. They're not the villain. They're not an object. All of these different things that we do in our minds that put us into disadvantage when working and gaming with other people, you solve those by seeing their point of view. Once you've done that, you increase the chances that your game master is willing to take a moment and understand your point of view. So try to explain your point of view. You can just be literal. Say, okay, I think I understand your point of view now. Give me a few moments. I'm going to kind of brain dump here as to how I approach the game and kind of what I enjoy about the game. Here's my point of view. And hopefully you can understand at least where I'm coming from. Even if you disagree with it, at least you have a greater understanding of me as a player, how I enjoy the game. So you can open it like that, just be direct. And then explain yourself. Then decide if there's any kind of compromise. That's the best solution. So it's unlikely, like change is hard in people. Change takes place over time, almost always. It's rare that suddenly you can snap your fingers and someone has a different worldview, a different game orientation, can suddenly switch views, has the capability even of understanding the forest for the trees and understanding a board game mentality versus a character simulation or I want to immerse myself into a believable world kind of point of view. Many people are incapable of kind of seeing those points of view at all. So if you can compromise, great. You can give a little, and the game master can give a little, and then keep the conversation going. So have that feedback loop after every game. If the game master is not willing to change, then now that you understand the game master's point of view, you can decide whether that's tolerable or not. And ultimately, you can only control that that's within your control. You can never control other people. So what are the levers, what are the options, what are the choices that you have that are entirely within your control, which is your attitude going into the game, your mental framework that's going into the game, the different ways that you can have fun. Maybe you can challenge yourself to master the rules of the game. It's like a puzzle, so that you can be the rules encyclopedia for the group and really help the group out that way. That's the best approach, the best outcome if the game master refuses to bend or compromise. Because if you don't resolve this difference in your mind, you're just going to continually be frustrated. This problem's not going to go away on its own. Another thing that you can do is ask in advance before choosing an action, so that you can at least understand how the game master is going to interpret the rules. So you can say, well, if I were to go up and attack from above from this rock, and the other players are slowly sneaking up, am I going to experience any penalties to hit? You can just ask outright, and hopefully the game master is willing to explain how the character perceives at least the dangers and the opportunities present in possible choices of action. You can master the rules. So once you learn the rules, then you won't be caught by surprise by these seemingly arbitrary impositions on your character. Or it could, go in your favor sometimes too, but it still doesn't make sense. Why would I get a bonus in this situation? That doesn't make sense in reality. So, the frustration works both penalties and in bonuses. But if you master the rules, at least you completely understand the mindset of the game. We've already talked about thinking of it as a board game. And here's some interesting reading that might help. There's lots of problem gamer threads on RPG.stack exchange. So there's one tag called Problem Players. If you go to it, you can see all kinds of threads, and there's lots of interesting advice in there. I don't know if there's a very specific thread to your question, but I found by reading those, I subscribe to their weekly newsletter, and there's almost always one player versus GM kind of a social issue, or player versus player social issue question in the newsletter. By reading those answers, you can see all the different ways that the social aspect of the game is the hardest. It's hardest to normalize as a group and to kind of all be on the same page and have the same kind of outlook and attitude and worldviews. So if by reading those threads you pick up some other ideas on how you can approach your game master, or how you can change your mental framework of the game and make it more enjoyable for you, then that's a victory for you. All right, I hope that helps a little bit. And I apologize for the long reply delay on that. I found that email. It's been in my inbox for a couple of months now, so I apologize for waiting so long to answer those. So hopefully those are good tips for you about balancing encounters, about weak and strong PCs, and about handling rules as written. Thanks for listening, and I hope you tune in to the next Role Playing Tips episode. Thanks.